I used to live in the outbacks of Kentucky, where there were a lot of woods around and many wild animals. It gave me a pretty good feeling every day. Well, almost every day. Before I get into it, let me give you some background on my home so you can better understand the situation. It was pretty secluded where I lived. The closest town was a good 30-minute drive away, making my old bus rides over an hour long in the mornings. Our neighboring houses were spaced out, but the land was nice, considering we built the house ourselves. We had a small garden, a chicken coop, rabbit hutches, and a pig pen. My family's 2 dogs protected these animals, while my dog stayed with the pig, as one of them was pregnant at the time. We only had about 6 acres of backwoods land before we reached one of those no hunting private property signs, with some barbed wire fencing all around. However, as I later found out, that fencing didn't do much good. A tree had fallen and broken part of it. Even though we often heard coyotes, we never actually saw signs of them, just raccoons, rabbits, squirrels, and lots of deer tracks. Going out there during late fall, winter, or the beginning of spring was something I enjoyed doing, even though my family had restrictions. I wasn't allowed out there at night. Now some of you might find this next part disturbing. Whenever one of our animals died, I had to take it out back and dump it near the fence to make sure nothing got too close to our property, particularly predators. The walk through the woods was always fun, but I sometimes felt like I was being watched. I figured it was just the environment, of course. Karma, my German Shepherd mix, was always with me when I did this. I never had him on a leash, something I deeply regretted after that night. I brought him because I trusted his senses more than my own. Whenever I felt like something or someone was watching me, Karma would just stop walking. Whenever I saw the fur on his back rise, I'd toss the animal as far as possible and head back home. Call me scared, but I'd rather be careful. Now that I've explained some things, I'll get to the point of the story. One of our prized roosters had died suddenly, and we hadn't noticed it lying on the chicken coop floor until it was time to put the chickens up for the night. When my older brother opened the back, we saw it was dead. We assumed this explained why Cookie, one of the family dogs, had been acting strange. Even though it was about 7 p.m. and I didn't want to go into the woods, since it was early fall, meaning there were big spider webs out there, my mom insisted I take the rooster to the designated area. I put on my boots and sweater to avoid mosquito bites and headed out, with Karma close by. His pen with the pig was only a few feet from the back steps, so it was easy to get to him if needed. Once I opened the pen, he shot out, excited to run around. With the Walmart bag containing the dead rooster in hand, I started toward the woods. Karma knew where we were going, and he followed me closely, as he often did. As a 17-year-old with no friends besides those I made online, I found his loyalty touching. I chuckled as I saw him standing at the bottom of the small hill, just staring at me. As I approached the drop-off area, I noticed Karma straying farther away. I let out a high-pitched whistle. He always came when I whistled, except this time he didn't. He raised his head, ears perked, and focused on something else. The fur on his back bristled, and then he bolted. Karma was never much of a barker unless a stranger was in the yard or the neighbor's dogs wandered over. So I was surprised when he barked once before taking off into the woods. That's when I noticed the fallen tree. Karma jumped onto it, over the fence and into the private property, chasing whatever he had seen. "Karma, get back here," I yelled, dropping the bag and chasing after him. I stopped at the fence, but he was gone, and his barking had stopped. This scared me, as it was getting dark, and all the daytime animals had gone silent, replaced by crickets and frogs. I knew I wasn't allowed on the other side of the fence, so I stood there, calling for him. "Karma, here boy," I shouted, growing frustrated. Tears welled up as I kept calling, but he didn't return. Naturally, I assumed he had gotten too far to hear me, so I bolted back home, out of breath by the time I got up the hill. "Mom," I called as I rushed inside. "He took off. I don't know where he is. He jumped the fence back there." "I told you to keep him on a leash when out there," she scolded as she got ready to help me find him. But the sun was already setting in our backyard, meaning it would be dark in the woods. "I'm sure he'll come back," she assured me, looking out the back door. Since it was too dark, I decided to walk down the street calling for Karma. Our neighbor noticed and asked if I was looking for someone. I told him my dog had run off into the woods. He nodded and disappeared into his backyard. I wasn't sure if he'd keep an eye out or not. 2 hours passed, and Karma still wasn't back. I cursed myself for not keeping him on the leash, as I went outside to feed the livestock dogs. As I was scooping their food, I thought I heard a high-pitched whistle. My mind was too preoccupied with Karma's absence to dwell on it. But when I reached the backyard, I heard a faint voice saying, "Here, boy." It sounded far away. I glanced toward the woods but saw nothing beyond what the moonlight revealed. Then I heard it again. "Here, boy." This time louder. Uneasy, I headed inside. A few thoughts ran through my mind. Was there someone in our woods? Had they lost their dog too? "Mom," I said as I went inside, "there's someone in the woods." She stopped what she was doing and went out to listen. Sure enough, we both heard it. "Here, boy." But the man never called the dog's name, something I hadn't noticed at first. He just kept repeating, "Here, boy," and "Come here." My mom gave me a scared look. "I think we should go help," I said, grabbing my Winchester BB gun. The actual guns were locked up, so this would have to do. "Should we?" she asked, just as we heard a dog bark. My heart lifted, hoping it was Karma, but it sounded like a hound dog, and it was getting farther away. Mom's instincts kicked in. She joined me as we went outside, calling for the dog. I was really looking for Karma, though. We got close to the tree line but stopped before going too far. Things were too quiet. We heard the man call again, sounding closer, even though the dog's barking was faint and far away. What was unsettling was that we heard no crunchy leaves underfoot, even though it was fall, and the ground was covered in dead foliage. The man was getting closer, but we saw no flashlight. That made us suspicious. When our neighbors had lost their cat, they had flashlights in the woods. Why didn't this person have one? We decided to stop calling out and turned back toward the yard. The dogs wagged their tails at the sight of us, but it wasn't the same without Karma. We walked along the tree line, staying a few feet back, scanning for any sign of light. None. Then we heard it. "Come here, boy," in a deep, angry voice. It came from somewhere to our right. The hair on the back of my neck rose. We rushed back to the house as the dogs went mad, growling and barking while everything else was silent. We got inside, turned out the lights, and stayed by the glass door watching. The thought occurred to me how odd this all was. The man never said the name of the dog he was supposedly calling. In fact, he repeated the exact words I had said earlier when Karma ran off. Was he copying me? My thoughts were interrupted when I saw my mom gasp and cover her mouth. She closed the curtains to the door and went pale. Without thinking, I peeked. One of our dogs was growling. I looked to where she was focused and saw something. What I saw wasn't human. Its skin was white, pale enough to glow in the moonlight. Its eyes were sunken, and it didn't seem to have a nose. It looked like it was upside down, crawling on its hands and feet like a crab walk, but its head was upright. Its back was arched, its stomach facing the sky as it slowly crept from the tree line. Its teeth didn't fit in its mouth, and its jaw hung open, with a dark slimy tongue hanging out. Its beady dark eyes scanned the area. "Come here, boy," it said in a chilling voice. Its head twitched, turning halfway before snapping upright again. It didn't seem to care about the dogs barking at it. Then it looked directly at the house, and for a moment, I swear we made eye contact. I couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. It felt like forever as we stared at each other until it slowly twisted its body with cracks and pops and began to stand. It was tall, at least 8 feet, and bony, with tight pale skin stretched over its lanky frame. Its arms were long, almost dragging on the ground, with long sharp black nails. Its body proportions were all wrong, with normal-sized legs but a bent torso. Patches of hair hung from its elbows and chest. I was petrified. How was it able to twist its body like that? How was something like this even alive? And what happened to Karma? Just then, I saw a flashlight shine through the backyard. It was our neighbor. He must have heard the dogs going crazy and came to check. I feared he'd be attacked, but the creature screeched and fled into the trees. Even after it was gone, I stood frozen, staring into the woods. Our neighbor knocked on the door, explaining that he heard the dogs. I didn't catch much of the conversation as I ran to the bathroom, feeling sick. Later, my mom asked me questions about what I saw, but I couldn't answer. She had only caught a glimpse. She didn't see the way it moved or the way it stared at me. Around 2 a.m., our neighbor called, saying he saw our dog in his backyard. I rushed out, and there was Karma, tail between his legs, knowing he was in trouble. But I couldn't be mad. I was just glad that whatever that thing was hadn't gotten to him. We moved to the city shortly after that experience. I thought writing this out might stop the nightmares, but they haven't. I can't shake the image of those eyes staring into mine. If you ever go hiking or into the woods, and you hear your own voice, someone repeating the exact words you've said, ignore it, run, and don't look back. My tribe, specifically the Kickapoo tribe, is spread out through Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Mexico. I have family everywhere, but I live in Oklahoma. Our tribe still practices traditional ceremonies. Basically, it's still old school. Outsiders are not welcome, and nobody writes anything down. Several tribal members don't even speak English, or know much about what's going on in the world. We don't really talk about the things I'm going to share with you because it's considered taboo. Honestly, if my family found out I was sharing this, they'd likely get very angry with me. I might ask about it someday, but the only one with more answers is probably my dad. However, he doesn't talk about taboo things, and it's hard to ask him anything. So why am I sharing this? Well, I figure as long as I don't give exact details, it should be fine. Some of the information I'm sharing is actually public, and it's not that hard to find, because we're not one of the bigger tribes in North America. I know some tribes here in America don't like sharing anything, but I've always thought that if we don't share or pass down information, stories, and practices, how will our culture survive, if it just dies out anyway? When I was young, there was a ceremony that had to take place in Mexico every year. All families essentially had to make the trip out of respect. I won't include exactly what happens, out of respect for my tribe, but all you need to know is that my grandma has a house down there where everyone goes. There are a lot of us, more than the house can hold. It's actually kind of cheap to build over there, so my grandmother had a smaller house built on the same property. My family, my aunt's family, and my uncle's family were there. My grandmother, being a superhero, was helping another group of family members with their ceremony since all the knowledge is passed down verbally. My mom was taking care of ours. The entire reservation in Mexico is located in the middle of nowhere. Once you get there, it's another 2 hours until you reach the actual property. You see, the land, or the res, was granted to the Kickapoo at the Hacienda Nemo, near the town of Moose Keys, in the state of Coahuila in 1850. The hacienda is occupied by the Mexican Kickapoo, and they call it Nemo Kickapoo, which in English means the birthplace of the Kickapoo tribe. The property contains around 177,000 acres of land, sourced with water from the Rio Sabinas. It's really big, with mountains within walking distance. My grandmother's house is actually at the foot of one of these mountains, and you guessed it, there are no good stories involving those mountains. The mountains are considered a taboo place. We don't go up there except for hunting, and even then, a ceremony must be done for protection. I was maybe 8 or 9 years old at the time. My aunt lives in Texas, and my sisters and I don't get to see our cousins very often. So these trips were the closest thing we had to family vacations, even though they were nothing but long work days. There's no electricity there, and as someone who grew up close to Oklahoma City, I sometimes forget how dark it can be when there are no cities nearby, and no cars on the road. Just finding the 2 small houses on the property can be difficult if no one has a fire going. There's a window in each room that is barred, and all the doors are made of steel. It's not pretty, but it's necessary since no one lives in these houses most of the time. The new house is different. The windows are still barred, but they can open. The old house's windows are just outdated glass. My sisters and I were playing with my cousins E and M in the new house. M is almost the same age as me, and E is 2 years younger. It was well after sundown, and the headlights on my uncle's truck were the only light. It was getting late and I say we, but really just the parents, had a long day of work ahead, so everyone started getting ready for lights out. My family was in the old house, so my siblings and I headed to our room. That's when it happened. I woke up to screaming, so did everyone else. You'd think I'd be panicked, but no, I was a kid who had just been woken up by what was clearly E screaming at the new house. I wanted to yell at him to shut up. I wasn't scared until my dad, who is very strong and quiet, walked into our room and told us to stay put. We don't disobey my dad, so we did. We went to the window and looked outside. My dad was talking to my aunt and uncle, along with some of my older cousins, and they were walking up and down the fence on our property with flashlights. It was too dark to see anything else. After an hour or so, we started getting tired and went back to sleep, but the adults stayed awake until sunrise. I later tracked down E and M to find out what happened. E wouldn't talk about it, and M didn't know. He said E saw something through the window, and we all got a little creeped out. On the last day, I asked my cousin G, who was one of the cousins walking up and down the fence that night. As a kid, G was something of a hero to me, tall, muscular, and genuinely cool with a death stare. He ended up telling me what happened when my sisters weren't around. Apparently, it was hot in the new house, so my cousins had opened all the windows. E was sleeping on the floor next to me when he woke up to something touching his face. An old, pale, naked woman was sticking her head through the bars and looking down at him. Her hair was long and gray, and it was her hair that had woken him up. He said she was smiling. Being even younger than me, he screamed and screamed until everyone came. After that, they looked around but never found anything. I was creeped out, but convinced E had just had a bad dream. Years later, I haven't been back to Mexico or Texas in a long time. To be honest, I'm not as involved in the traditional side of my tribe anymore. My sisters have kind of taken over. I still help when I can, but I have a busy job. Just out of curiosity, I called my mom to ask about that night. Surely I wasn't the only one who thought E was just having a bad dream. I regret asking. Now I have this uneasy feeling in my stomach whenever I think about it. My mom told me this wasn't the first time the old woman had been seen, and she was wrong. They did find something. Footprints. Footprints going from the window to the fence, headed toward the mountains. Judging from the prints, she had visited every window on the property. Mind you, we were in the middle of nowhere, in the pitch black. On a personal note, I think she might have been a witch. Our tribe, being traditionally strong, is both a blessing and a curse. Like other tribes, for example, the Navajo, who believe in skinwalkers. I want to say the old lady was likely a skinwalker who preys on people living near the mountains. Maybe. I've heard other stories from my family, and have even had weird experiences down in Mexico that still make me nervous about going outside after dark. It doesn't help that my dog always insists on going outside in the middle of the night, making me chase him around to bring him back inside. Even if it's not a skinwalker, there are some really creepy things going on in that area, especially around the mountains. I talked to a friend in Oklahoma, and he said it might be a stakini. I'm sure the most famous native witch you've heard of is the skinwalker, but in Oklahoma, they have something similar, the stakini, shapeshifters of pure evil. By day they look like humans, blending in with everyone else, but at night, they transform into owl-like monsters. Or maybe it was an estini, people who use supernatural powers to harm others and can take the shape of a horned owl. In some other native tribes down in Mexico, they call it the nagual. It's intriguing, and maybe not a coincidence, that many native tribes share stories of similar witches. These creatures, monsters, or whatever you want to call them, are often believed to be humans who practice a form of witchcraft that grants them such powers. They aren't actual monsters. Maybe the generations before us saw and knew things we can't fully understand today. These stories and beliefs have been passed down as part of our cultural memory, a reminder of the things our ancestors encountered. So, if you ever visit native land or a reservation, whether that's in New Mexico, the Navajo Nation, Arizona, Oklahoma, the Dakotas, or even down in Mexico, it might seem like these stories are everywhere, and who knows, maybe they are. Just be safe and respectful of the traditions and stories. You never know what might be out there, and it's always better to be cautious and respectful than to dismiss what might actually be true. Stay safe. I kept telling myself it was over when the hinges on the door snapped from the banging. The wood splintered and withered as the wooden door collapsed onto the floor. The small screws that held it in place echoed as they rolled down, matching the beat of my heart, which felt like it was about to spring out of my chest. I was stuck in my summer cabin during the winter, snowed in because I was too stupid to leave before the storms came. The Forest Service had announced it was time to leave about 2 weeks ago, since my cabin is located on top of some mountains that get too much snow in the winter. I always leave on time when the Forest Service announces the closure, but I thought it would be fun to stay through the winter this time. The main reason I wanted to stay was due to the COVID lockdown, with everything closed. I figured it would be better to stay here, something I had never done before. I came prepared. I boarded up the lower windows like I always did, to ensure the snow wouldn't break through. I also stockpiled enough food to last until February, and made sure to call the power company to keep the electricity on, since I planned to stay longer this year. I didn't regret my decision until the first snowstorm hit. That's when reality set in. There was no leaving until the snow melted, and it was only going to get worse, since it was too cold for any of it to thaw. More snowstorms were coming my way. I spent most of my time building puzzles while listening to the old CDs I had stored in the cabin. Memories of my wife and children, their smiling faces sitting at this very table, brightened my mood for a moment. But that was short-lived, and I wished they were here with me, especially my wife, who had died 4 years ago. As I was thinking about her, I heard scratching coming from the back wall. Wondering if an animal was trying to get in, I opened the front door and yelled to scare it off. The scratching stopped, and with a smile, I slowly began to close the door, until I heard whispering. It was faint, but it was coming closer. Standing there, I wondered what was making the sound. I remembered my CD player was on, so I brushed it off, thinking that must have been what I heard. I returned to working on the puzzle after grabbing a drink from the fridge. After I closed the fridge door, the scratching started again, coming from the back wall. This time, I let it be. It wasn't bothering me enough to investigate, and it could have been branches brushing against the side of the cabin. "Dad, come look at this," a voice whispered from behind me. A tingle shot down my spine as I turned around to find no one there. The strange thing was the voice. It sounded so familiar, but I hadn't heard it in years. "Hello?" I called out to the now quiet cabin after turning off the CD player. "Dad, it's cold. Help me," the voice said again, and it hit me. It was the voice of my daughter when she was younger. "Sarah, is that you?" I asked, wondering what the hell was going on. "Dad, it's cold out here. Please let me inside," the voice said again, more clearly this time. I knew for a fact that this wasn't just my imagination. But Sarah wasn't here. She was married and expecting a baby girl in the spring. How could this be possible? "Are you going to let me die, Dad, just like you let Mom?" The words froze me in place. My body felt as if it had turned to stone. Was this my imagination, or something darker? "Please, it's so cold," the voice pleaded. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's me, Sarah, your daughter. Please open the door, or I'm going to freeze out here." The voice came from the other side of the door. It sounded robotic. I slowly tried to think of what to do. Grabbing the metal rod I used for stirring the fire, I gripped it tightly and backed away from the door. "You're not my daughter. Get the hell off my property," I screamed, still backing away. The voice changed and it shook me to my core. "Honey, why won't you let us in? Sarah wants to warm up next to the fire, and I want to see your smiling face again." Hearing that, I almost dropped the rod. It was the voice of my wife. I took a step forward, thinking it might actually be her. My mind flooded with happy memories, but then I remembered attending her funeral. The voice outside wasn't my wife. It couldn't be. "What do you want? Please, whoever's out there, I'm just an old man. I have nothing here worth stealing. Please, leave me alone." "Honey, don't you recognize me? Please, take the boards off the window so we can see each other," the voice begged. Shocked to my core and unsure of what to do next, I stayed quiet while moving towards the bathroom. I snuck inside and locked the door, hoping whatever was out there would go away. Was someone trying to mess with me? How could they have even gotten out here with all that snow? I heard the voice say something faint through the bathroom door, followed by a loud bang on the front door. Then another, and another. I could hear the hinges starting to loosen. I kept telling myself it was over when the hinges snapped. The wood splintered, and the wooden door collapsed to the floor. I held my breath, listening as the wooden floorboards creaked with every step from whatever had broken down the door. Whoever it was had to be sadistic, messing with me like this. Until I heard sniffing. The footsteps shifted to crawling, coming closer and closer, until it was on the other side of the bathroom door. "I smell you," the voice said, deeply. Chills ran up and down my body as I gripped the metal rod, ready for the bathroom door to be broken down just like the front door. Suddenly I heard another voice calling, "Mr. Miller, are you there? I heard you were planning on staying over the winter, and I'm sorry, but you're not allowed to. Are you in there? What happened to your door?" I didn't know what to do. Should I warn whoever was out there, or was this just another trick? I took a deep breath. I couldn't just stay where I was. I unlocked the bathroom door and swung it open, prepared to fight. As I did, I felt the door hit something. I shoved harder until I heard someone wince in pain. I pulled the door back to see a park ranger on the ground. I quickly looked around to see if anything else was there, waiting to attack, but I didn't see anything. "Are you okay?" I asked the park ranger, trying to help him up. Yeah," he said, rubbing his head. "The real question is, are you okay? What's going on here? I thought you got attacked by a bear or something, with the side of the cabin all scratched up and the door knocked over, letting all this cold air in." "Honestly, I don't know what was here. I never saw it, but it sounded like another person. Are there any other vehicles out there besides mine and yours?" "No, I didn't see any others," he replied. "No one else is up here besides us. This area is closed during the winter. We got a call from the power company that you were still up here, requesting power through the winter. Look, we don't want to kick you out, but we have these rules to keep everyone safe. Now, we need to get out of here right now." "I get it, but what's the rush? I still need to clean this place up and fix that door. There's no time. We've already been here long enough. We need to leave. Your vehicle won't make it down in this weather, so hop in mine, and we can get out of here." "You can't expect me to just up and leave everything, can you?" I asked. "If you want to live, you can. Plus, you can come back once winter ends, but we need to leave before that thing comes back." "Wait, are you talking about that thing that knocked down my door? You know about it. What is it?" The park ranger looked at me and shook his head. "All you need to know is that we need to get out of here." He grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the front door. As we were leaving, I heard the scratching coming from the back wall again, but I ignored it as we ran outside and jumped into his Jeep. He drove down the snowy mountain, trying his best to keep the Jeep from sliding off the side. As he drove, I started to ask him, "So what was that thing that broke down my door? And don't try to sugarcoat it or tell me it was a bear, because no bear mimics a human voice like that." The ranger sighed before replying, "I guess you already know enough that it won't matter if I tell you. But to be honest, we're just as confused as you are. We've been trying to figure it out over the years, but every time we leave people in this area over the winter to investigate, they go missing. And there's no explanation for who or what did it." "Really? So I'm not losing my mind. What else do you know about it?" "Nothing more than what I already said, besides the fact that this thing only seems to come out during the winter. That's why we have that rule for all the cabin owners in this area. They're not allowed to stay here during the winter." We blame it on the snow and cold winters, and those are good reasons, but the main reason is that thing. We have no idea how to deal with it, so we've been following these rules since the 1950s, when someone first saw it. Upon hearing this, I sat there motionless. I couldn't tell if the guy was messing with me. I never actually saw this creature, and what if it was him the whole time? When I opened the bathroom door, I hid him, and that's exactly where that creature had been just moments before. I kept wondering this, until I started to hear a faint scratching coming from the back of the Jeep. Back when I was young, my old man and I would go hunting with my older brother and sister out in Kerrville. I remember the trailer would sometimes smell like that rusty blood smell, but we always got used to it. Aside from all of this, there was some scary stuff that always happened out there. I remember when I was about 12, and my dad had shot a deer right behind the shoulder, but it managed to get away, so we had to go track it. It was around mid-November, and it was starting to get dark, so I had my SKS, which I'd been using to kill deer since I was young. I also had a flashlight with me. Being crafty, my dad put me in a valley where we found a pretty good pool of blood, and I sat on top of a boulder just to mark the spot, while he took my brother and put him further out past the tree line, deep along the ravine. There were tons of rocks and boulders all over the place, so I got up on a boulder that had a pretty good viewpoint. It also had a decent clearing of about 50 to 75 yards around me. Well, the night started to set in, and it was about 50 degrees or so, eventually dropping even more. I was in the middle of this clearing with a light overcast and a full moon. I remember clicking the light off to save the battery and letting my eyes adjust to my surroundings. Just about 30 or 40 minutes after my brother and my dad left me, I remember hearing some coyotes and seeing them on the outskirts of the clearing. However, they weren't circling. They paused for a bit to look, and then continued on. I sat quietly on the boulder, watching nature go by, with the wind picking up slowly, giving a gentle strobing effect with the cloud overcast switching from light to no light. I heard the coyotes yip and howl a few times, and then they started to fade away. Minutes after that, I heard a resounding shot and the report of impact, like a boom. I figured that they either found the deer and put it down, or someone shot a coyote. Around that time I heard a scream, which actually got me worried. Then, just silence. The wind stopped howling, the pine trees stopped rustling, and I couldn't hear any of the coyotes in the distance again, just dead silence. After a bit, I started hearing some light sounds to my right, almost like rocks banging together up the hillside at the furthest distance, about 75 yards from the clearing. I saw a few rocks tumbling down the side. I watched them bounce along, and then I got real low on the boulder, with my SKS ready, aiming at the point of the sound. A few more rocks did the same thing from the same spot, and that's when I saw a dark outline through the trees, not quite in the clearing, but rather a few yards deep in the trees. I saw a pair of antlers when the light picked them up, and then it went dark. I could hear some heavy breathing along the edge of the clearing, and I started to think it was an injured deer. I keyed the radio that we all had 3 times to signal distress so that my dad and brother would come back. I turned the volume really low and sat quietly on the rock, making sure not to silhouette myself as I peered into the darkness with my scope, trying to get a good picture. I remember seeing the outlines somewhat upright in the light, like it was a bug stretching its neck out, and then it went dark again. I did panic a bit, despite being just 12, knowing that the hooves of a deer should clack pretty loudly if they moved at all, especially when it was that quiet. So I sat and waited, not moving a muscle, as that pool of blood next to me seemed to lazily waft into my nose. It wasn't overpowering, but it cut in pretty strong as I scanned again when the clouds cleared for a few moments. I looked for anywhere that thing could have gone. My radio keyed back twice, meaning someone wanted to talk. I keyed 3 times again and saw lights over my left shoulder where my dad and brother had gone to track the buck, still a few hundred yards off in the distance. I sat there alone, jittering quietly in the cold, with a lingering hope that my dad and brother would catch up. The light went out again, and I could hear those rocks rolling just a bit from a spot further up the hill but a few yards closer. The rocks rose into view when the cloud passed, and I looked up. I could see a dark figure again with some antlers about 60 yards away, with a few trees in between. Knowing where my brother and dad were, I leveled the rifle and waited for a clear shot. I was a hair away from pulling the trigger when it went dark again, so I waited patiently for the moon to come out again. When it did, whatever was out there had disappeared. It didn't make much sense considering it had been behind a few trees with considerable openings to each side. I scanned again in the same direction when the wind picked back up, and the hillside came alive again with the trees moving. I heard the footsteps of my family behind me, about 90 yards out, and I slowly crept off the boulder to meet them, keeping that rifle close to me the whole time. When we met, my brother started giving me crap about how I was screaming and crying about being all alone. When I told them I hadn't made a sound, they raised their eyebrows and started claiming I was full of BS. I asked about the shot I had heard, and apparently, there was a ways off on the next property over, since we were near the property line. They had found a pretty good blood trail that left the original spot where I was, in almost a straight line, leading to some crushed brush about 100 yards away. Having this deer bleed that much the whole time was somewhat unreal. After the trail ended, they moved around a few thousand yards to scan the area where they heard the shot, which seemed like it was over the low fence line. I told them about what I saw, which I could only describe as a deer, except that it left without me getting a good look at it. We hiked back up the hill in a staggered column, with my brother picking up the rear with his firearm and my dad leading. We made our way back to the truck. When we got there, my brother Cody and I hopped into the bed of the truck, him overlooking the cabin, and me watching the tailgate, as we started down a pretty long trail to the camp house. After a mile or so, we had to take a detour through the brush, because a few trees had collapsed on the trail. We went around through some clearings in the Dodge. Just before we got back on the trail, it got really tight with the trees, and we had to get ahead and walk in front of the truck to make sure it could fit. After clearing everything, we got back into our spots on the truck. Just as we were about to hit the road, I spotted another pair of different antlers nestled between the brush. I hollered to my dad, who had his window rolled down. He took out his 1911 from the center console and blasted the buck between the eyes with a .230 grain round. It turns out this was the deer we were tracking, but it had somehow ended up a few miles down the path with a heart shot, which is pretty impossible. It looked like it had a good gouge on it near the point of impact on the ribs, as if it had fallen on punji sticks or something. There was no blood trail anywhere near it, just the deer standing between two bushes by itself. We loaded it up into the back of the truck, and I sat on top of it with my SKS pointed at its head for the rest of the night. Everything went according to plan after that. We skinned the deer and iced the meat. However, over the next 8 years or so, my brother and I would still hear some screams on our hunting trips at night. There shouldn't be any people around for the next 10 miles or so. I forgot to mention, there are all kinds of burial grounds and stuff like that on the land. We found many piles of old arrowheads, Victorian-era utensils, and some old burned-down houses that have been there since the settlement of Texas. I told my sister about what happened, and being the oldest of all of us, she started joking about it being a skinwalker, as the Native Americans would call it. I think she was just teasing me, though I'm not so sure it was a joke out there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I never had another encounter like that, but there were always certain things on that land that would creep me out. We would find old stone buildings with just piles of animal skulls stacked to the ceiling filling the room up. So if you ever visit Texas, be mindful of the roads you come across. Or if you're familiar with Texas, you know that there are some country roads that go on for hours with nothing in sight. There are some lands that contain things that are creepy and evil. We were driving back from town like we always did when the sun was setting. Our trailer was far from everything, and the only way to get groceries or anything we needed was to drive 45 minutes to the nearest town. That day felt just like any other, until it wasn't. I sat in the back seat, my earbuds in, staring out the window. The desert landscape blurred by, with nothing but dry brush, dirt, and distant mountains as far as I could see. It was getting darker, and the headlights were the only thing lighting up the road ahead. My parents were quiet up front, probably tired from the trip. It should have been peaceful, but something felt wrong. It started as just a feeling, like we weren't alone, like something was out there in the dark. I glanced out the window again, trying to shake off the weird vibe, but then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. There was this dark shadow moving alongside the car. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but it was still there. It wasn't a person, it was too low to the ground for that. I leaned closer to the window to get a better look, and that's when the smell hit me. I don't know how to describe it. It was awful, like something dead and rotten, mixed with something sharp and sour. I gagged and pulled out my earbuds, quickly rolling up the window. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do. "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling, "there's something out there." She didn't hear me at first, so I said it louder. "Mom, something's following us." She glanced in the rearview mirror, her face going pale as she caught a whiff of the smell too. "What is that?" she muttered, her voice tight. She pressed her foot on the gas, making the car speed up. I looked back out the window, and the shadow was still there, keeping up with us. It moved so fast, faster than any animal I'd ever seen. And it was big, bigger than a dog, though it kind of looked like one. But something about it was wrong. Its shape was too strange, too twisted. Fear gripped my chest and I felt tears sting my eyes. I knew what it was, or at least I thought I did. We had heard stories growing up about skinwalkers, creatures that could shapeshift, often into animals, and they weren't just scary stories to us, they were real, and one was right outside. "Mom, it's a skinwalker," I blurted out. My mom's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She didn't say anything, but she pressed harder on the gas, the engine roaring as we sped down the road. For a few seconds, I thought we might get away from it. The shadow started to fade, and the smell went with it. But when we pulled up to our trailer, the stench came back, worse than before. My stomach churned, and I felt like I might throw up. There was a rustling sound in the woods next to our home, like something big was moving through the trees. We didn't waste any time. My mom grabbed the groceries from the car, and we rushed inside, locking the door behind us. The smell seemed to follow us, lingering in the air. I couldn't stop shaking, and I could tell my mom was scared too, though she tried to hide it. She quickly closed the blinds, muttering a prayer under her breath. I just stood there, frozen, listening for anything outside, wondering if we were really safe. That night, I tried to calm down. My mom told me everything was fine now, that the skinwalker or whatever was out there was gone. The smell had disappeared, and the dog had stopped barking, but I couldn't shake the fear gnawing at my chest. Every noise, every creak of the house made my heart race. After we put away the groceries, I went to my room, trying to convince myself it was over. But the whole time, I kept replaying the moment in the car, the shadow running alongside us, the horrible smell, the way my mom had driven so fast. I didn't want to think about it, but the thoughts wouldn't leave me alone. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again. A loud thump, like something heavy had jumped on the roof. I sat up, my heart pounding. What could be on the roof? Maybe it was just a branch or something. Or maybe not. I held my breath listening. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps walking back and forth on the roof above me. My body froze with fear. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a person, or something pretending to be a person. I leapt out of bed and ran to my parents' room. My mom was already awake, and so was my dad. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. My dad nodded, his face serious. "Stay here," he said as he grabbed his gun from the closet. "Don't go outside." I knew I should have listened. I really did. But my curiosity got the better of me. I needed to know what was on the roof. So when my dad went to the front door, I followed quietly behind him, staying just a few steps back. Outside, the air was still and cold. My dad stepped onto the porch, his gun raised, scanning the roof with a flashlight. I stayed on the steps, watching. I didn't see anything at first, just the empty sky and the dark outline of our roof. But then, I felt it. That same awful smell from earlier, even stronger now. My stomach turned, and my legs felt like jelly. That's when I saw them, two glowing red eyes staring down at me from the roof. They didn't blink, they didn't move, just stared. I gasped, stumbling backward. "Dad!" I screamed, pointing up. My dad looked up, and without hesitation, he started shooting at the creature. The loud gunshots echoed in the night, and the red eyes disappeared as the creature darted out of sight. "Get inside, now!" my dad yelled. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran back into the house, my dad close behind me. We slammed the door shut, locking it tight. But the footsteps didn't stop. We could hear them again, pacing back and forth on the roof, louder now, like whatever it was knew we were scared. That night none of us slept. We huddled together in my parents' room, listening to the noises on the roof. They didn't stop until morning. When the sun finally came up, everything went quiet. The next day, we went outside, hoping to find answers. That's when we saw it. One of our dogs was dead, and in the dirt around the trailer were strange footprints. They started as hooves like a cow's, but as they trailed off they turned into human footprints. I didn't say anything, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never disobey my parents again. It was late October, and the wind outside was howling like something was angry. I sat by the fire pit at my grandparents' ranch in New Mexico, staring into the flames. The ranch had always been a peaceful place for me, far from the noise of the city. I liked coming here, especially in the fall when the air was cool and the sky was huge and clear. But tonight, something felt different, like the quiet was too quiet and the shadows were too long. Even the wind sounded strange, almost like it was whispering. Ethan, my cousin, sat across from me, poking at the fire with a stick. He was always joking around, but tonight he seemed serious. His face lit up by the flickering flames. We hadn't talked much, just sat there, listening to the wind and watching the fire crackle. "You ever hear about skinwalkers?" Ethan asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up from the fire. "Skinwalkers? What's that?" Ethan's eyes narrowed and he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "They're evil witches, or spirits. I'm not really sure, but they can change shape. Like they can turn into animals, wolves, coyotes, stuff like that." I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I tried to play it cool. "You mean like a shapeshifter?" "Yeah, but not like in the movies," he said. "These things, they're bad. They're not just animals. There's something else. Something wrong." I forced a laugh. "Come on, Ethan. That's just some legend, right? A story to scare kids." Ethan didn't laugh. He just stared into the fire. "My dad saw one once," he said quietly. "Out near the old cattle pens. He thought it was a coyote, but when he looked into its eyes, he knew. It wasn't just an animal. It was like it was looking inside him." My stomach tightened, but I tried to shake off the creepy feeling. "So what did he do?" "He backed away, real slow," Ethan said. "Then he ran. But he swears that thing followed him home. That night, he heard scratching at the windows, like it was trying to get in. And he heard it whispering his name." I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, suddenly feeling like we were being watched. "You're making this up," I said, though my voice was shakier than I wanted it to be. Ethan shrugged, a small smile on his face. "Believe what you want, but don't go wandering off alone tonight." We sat in silence for a while after that. The wind was picking up, and the fire was starting to die down. The shadows around us seemed to stretch even further, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, hiding just beyond the light. My skin tingled like we weren't alone. "I'm going inside," I said, standing up and brushing the dirt off my jeans. "It's getting too cold out here." Ethan looked up at me and nodded. "Yeah, I'll be right behind you." As I turned to walk back to the house, I thought I heard something. A low growl, so deep it was almost like a vibration. I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Ethan was already standing, his eyes wide. "Don't move," he said. "Whatever you do, don't run." The growl came again, louder this time, rumbling through the ground beneath my feet. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I didn't want to turn around, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I looked over my shoulder. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the firelight, two glowing eyes stared back at me, shining in the darkness. They were too high off the ground to be any normal animal, and they were locked right on us. My breath caught in my throat as the thing stepped forward, just enough for me to make out its shape. It looked like a wolf, but it was wrong. Its limbs were too long and bent at weird angles, and its fur was dirty, matted, and rotten looking. But the worst part was its eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They were full of something dark, something evil. "Ethan," I whispered, barely able to speak. "I know," he said, his voice shaking. "Don't run. Just back away." Slowly. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were glued to the ground. The creature let out another low growl, and its lips pulled back to reveal sharp, yellowed teeth. My whole body went cold. Ethan grabbed my arm and pulled me back a step. "Come on," he hissed. "Get to the house. Don't turn your back on it." We started moving, step by step, inching away from the fire and toward the house. My legs felt like jelly, and every muscle in my body was screaming for me to run. But I knew I couldn't. The creature was watching us, its eyes glowing brighter as it took another step forward. Suddenly, it lunged. "Run!" Ethan shouted, yanking me hard as we bolted toward the house. I ran as fast as I could, my feet barely touching the ground. Behind us I could hear the creature, its heavy footsteps pounding, its breath hot and ragged, its growl turning into a savage snarl. It was close, too close. My lungs were burning and my legs were on fire, but I couldn't stop. The porch light was just ahead. We were almost there. Ethan reached the steps first, leaping up them and throwing open the door. I was right behind him, but just as I hit the bottom step, something sharp slashed across my ankle. I screamed and crashed to the ground. "Get up!" Ethan yelled from the doorway. I tried, but the pain was so bad I couldn't move. I looked back, and the creature was right there, towering over me. It was even bigger up close, and its eyes burned into mine with this horrible, twisted intelligence. Its breath smelled like something dead, and I thought for sure it was going to tear me apart. But then, something strange happened. The creature stopped. It straightened up, its limbs cracking and popping as it began to change. Its fur started to disappear, and its body twisted, bones snapping and reshaping. My heart raced as I watched it transform. Within seconds, it wasn't a wolf anymore. It was standing upright like a person, but it wasn't human. Its skin was pale, almost glowing, and its face was a nightmare. Long, jagged teeth, eyes still glowing with that terrible light. It leaned down toward me, its breath icy cold on my face. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered in a voice that made my skin crawl. Somehow, I kicked out, hitting it hard enough to make it stumble back. I scrambled to my feet and ran, half limping up the stairs. Ethan grabbed me, pulling me inside just as the creature lunged at the door, its claws scraping against the wood as we slammed it shut. We were safe, for now, but I knew this wasn't over. Inside the house, Ethan and I collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. My ankle throbbed in pain, but that was nothing compared to the terror racing through my mind. The creature was still out there. We could hear it, circling the house, growling and scraping its claws against the walls. It wanted in. "What was that thing?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Ethan didn't answer right away. He was staring at the door, like he was expecting it to burst open any second. Finally, he whispered, "A skinwalker." I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to believe it wasn't real, that this was just some horrible dream. but the pain in my ankle and the sounds outside were all too real. The creature was still out there, pacing back and forth, its claws scraping the ground like it was trying to find a way in. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's going to get in." Ethan shook his head. "There's nowhere else to go. We just have to wait until morning." I looked at the windows. They rattled every time the creature howled. I could see its shadow moving outside, and every time it passed by, my heart pounded harder. How could we survive the whole night with that thing out there? The house creaked and groaned like it was as scared as we were. Every little noise made me jump. Every time the wind howled, I thought it was the creature breaking through. I didn't know how much longer I could take it. "We need to call for help," I said, suddenly remembering my phone. I pulled it out of my pocket, but there was no signal. Of course, we were too far from the nearest town, out in the middle of nowhere. "What do we do?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. "No one's going to believe us," Ethan said, his voice flat. "Even if we could call someone, what would we say? That a monster is trying to kill us?" He was right. Who would believe us? We'd sound crazy. But we had to do something. The creature let out a long, bone-chilling howl. It sounded closer now, like it was right outside the door. I grabbed Ethan's arm, and he looked at me, fear in his eyes. Neither of us moved. We didn't dare make a sound. The only thing we could do was sit there, huddled together, hoping the creature wouldn't find a way in. The minutes felt like hours. Every time the creature scratched at the walls or growled, I thought it was the end. But then, slowly, the noises started to fade. The creature seemed to be moving away. "Do you think it's gone?" I whispered. Ethan didn't answer. We both just sat there, waiting, listening. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped completely. The only thing we could hear was the wind outside. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, we dared to move. We stood up, our legs stiff and shaky, and slowly opened the door. The yard was empty. The creature was gone. But the deep claw marks in the ground and on the door were proof it had been real. "We're safe now, right?" I asked, even though I didn't really believe it. Ethan didn't say anything. He just stared out into the desert, his face pale. I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. It wasn't over. That creature was still out there somewhere, waiting. And I had a terrible feeling it wasn't done with us yet. I've always been a night owl, so working the graveyard shift at the gas station didn't bother me. It wasn't like we had many customers at night anyway. Most of the time, I'd sit behind the counter, watching whatever late-night shows were on or flipping through some magazines. It was 1992, and I'd been doing this job for a while now. The gas station was tucked away in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by thick, dark woods. Honestly, it felt like the middle of nowhere. Now I'm a pretty big guy, 6'10", with a face that usually makes people think I'm angry, even when I'm not. I get it. My size and the way I look can be intimidating, but anyone who knows me will tell you I'm a gentle giant. Being Native American, my people have a long history here, and there are lots of old stories, legends, and superstitions in the area. Some of them I grew up hearing, and to be honest, I believe in them. Maybe that's why this particular night shook me up so much. It was just another quiet shift. The only sound was the buzz of the overhead lights and the low murmur of the TV. The woods surrounding the gas station were dark and dense, and the lights from the station barely reached the trees. The place always had an eerie feel to it late at night, but I was used to it. Sometime after midnight, a customer came in. He looked like any other guy, bought some gas, a pack of cigarettes, and a soda, then headed back out to his car. I watched him leave through the big front window. That's when I saw something strange. At the edge of the woods, just beyond the gas station's lights, there was this huge dog sitting there. At first I thought it might be a wolf, but it was way too big. The way the gas station was lit, with bright lights casting long shadows, it was hard to see the thing clearly. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the dog, or whatever it was, disappeared into the trees before I could make out any real details. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just a big stray, or maybe my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. After all, animals come around sometimes, and it's not like a wolf or a stray dog was going to come inside. Still, something about the size of that thing bothered me. I tried to go back to watching TV, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My mind wandered back to the stories I'd heard growing up, stories about strange creatures in the woods, things that could change shape and walk between worlds. My people have always believed in that stuff, and maybe I do too, a little more than I like to admit. But I wasn't going to let some old stories get to me. I told myself it was just a big dog, nothing more. The night went on, and I went back to flipping through the channels, trying to push the strange sighting out of my mind. Still, there was this lingering feeling in the back of my head, a sense that something was watching me from the shadows outside. But for now, I stayed put behind the counter, telling myself everything was fine. It was probably around 3 a.m. when I heard the noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a raccoon knocking over the trash cans. It came from the back of the gas station, where we kept the dumpsters. We'd had homeless people dig through the trash before, so I didn't think too much of it. But then the noise got louder. It sounded like something big was tearing through the garbage. I glanced out the window, but I couldn't see anything from where I was sitting. The thought of that big dog I'd seen earlier popped back into my head, and I felt a chill run down my spine. What if it was still hanging around? I didn't really want to go check it out, but the noise wasn't stopping, and it was starting to freak me out. I grabbed the flashlight from under the counter and, just to be safe, took the gun we kept in the office. I didn't think I'd need it, but I wasn't about to take any chances. My heart was pounding in my chest as I headed for the door. The gas station was eerily quiet, except for the rustling and banging coming from the back. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me. It was dark, but the lights from the gas station cast long shadows on the ground, making everything seem even creepier. I walked slowly toward the back, the flashlight beam shaking a little because my hands were trembling. I kept telling myself it was just some animal, maybe a stray dog, nothing more. When I rounded the corner and aimed the flashlight at the dumpsters, I saw it. But it wasn't a dog. It was standing on its hind legs, just as tall as me, maybe even taller. My flashlight beam hit its face, and I froze. Its eyes glowed in the light, reflecting like the eyes of an animal. But there was something unnatural about them. They looked wrong, like they weren't supposed to be there. The thing stood there staring at me, and for a moment, I couldn't move. My whole body went numb with fear. It had the shape of a wolf or a dog, but it was standing like a person. And those eyes, they were locked onto mine, glowing in the darkness. I felt like I was staring into something that didn't belong in this world. My hands went slack, and I dropped the flashlight. It hit the ground with a thud, and in that second, I snapped out of it. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I sprinted back toward the gas station as fast as I could, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was following me. I burst through the door, slamming it behind me and locking it. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. I stood there shaking, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The thing didn't follow me. I didn't leave the gas station for the rest of the night. When my shift finally ended, I quit. I'm convinced I saw something from the old stories, a skinwalker. Whatever it was, I never wanted to see it again. What?